1. Crystal. I'm Crystal Banks, and I'm about to give you no-holds-barred access to the deepest, darkest secrets of my mind. I can't guarantee that you'll like everything you read in the pages to come, but just know that it's the truth. Every last word of it. I'd been privy to some pretty weird and mysterious stuff in my short 25 years on this planet. I'm talking about the types of encounters that give you nightmares and make you purchase fancy security systems. But before I start yammering on about haunted woods and monsters, I think it's best to hit the rewind button and take you back to the beginning. Well, not quite that far, because I'm sure my childhood would only bore you. Trust me, none of you want to read about my first kiss, because it was nothing but a bunch of awkward nose bumping. Instead, I'm going to start with the seriously crappy weekend that changed my life forever. It all began when I walked in on my boyfriend doing the nasty with the student from my grad class with the highest GPA. She had not only graduated summa cum laude, but had somehow managed to juggle a ridiculous amount of resume-padding extracurriculars. I guess the whole bit about men not liking intelligent women was a lie, at least so long as those brains were paired with a big enough rack. I don't understand what he saw in her other than the fact that she was blonde and busty. Personally, I refused to bleach my hair just because being brunette wasn't popular. I had long, dark brown hair with blunt bangs that generally felt like they were stuck to my eyelashes. That got annoying fast. I'm 5'10", so maybe I was just too tall for Bryce the cheater, otherwise known as the man I would never sleep with again under any circumstances, not even in the classic last man on earth scenario. The height-sensitive loser had always complained when I wore heels, but essentially, it didn't matter why he had gone out and cheated on me. Whether he was looking for bigger boobs or a shorter and thinner figure was of no concern to me because I wasn't willing to change a single thing about myself. Well, at least not for that two-timing loser. I wasn't ready to rule out all men at that point, just one. There were so many lovely questions lolling about in my angry mind. Was that the first time he'd been unfaithful? Had there been other women? And why? Oh, why did he have to do it on our sheets? I felt dirty, and if I discovered that I had an STD because of him, I was determined to knife him in the balls. Quite frankly, I was sure that any jury would side with me. I made the stabbing motion with my right hand and smiled darkly at the thought. Once it was over, I realized that I'd never loved Bryce. But even so, I would never have done something so despicable to him. I'm just the faithful type, I guess. If I'm being honest, there's something that upset me far more than the fact that he'd sought some action on the side. Our breakup had rendered me homeless. I may have purchased those incredible hotel thread count sheets, but the apartment was his. Well, actually, it belonged to his parents. But any way you looked at it, he got to keep it, and I was out of my cushy place to live. None of this would have mattered if I'd had tons of money at my disposal, but I didn't. I'd barely made it through school, and I was up to my ears in debt. Trust me, I looked into it, and you can't turn in your master's degree for a refund. But there was no use crying over spilled milk because none of it would matter soon. I was determined not to sleep until I landed a new job. Thanks to a somewhat aggressive email campaign, I'd managed to finagle back-to-back interviews with several of the publishing firms in town, so all I had to do was dazzle them. I felt like I'd spent my whole life in school, mainly because I had spent my whole life in school. I should have quit years before, back when I was only 50 grand in debt. I suppose it was my own fault, because I hadn't felt that a bachelor's degree would be enough to land me a good job. I'd added on 2 more years of debt, aka schooling, in order to pursue my master's degree in English. By that point, I'd racked up so much school and credit card debt that I doubted I'd be able to pay it all off before I got old and died. To add insult to injury, I'd maxed out my last credit card in order to buy the hideous outfit I was wearing for my interviews. The navy suit dress looked even worse on me than it had on the hanger. I felt like a total dork, not to mention unfashionable. But this was the type of crap people had to wear when they were trying to get a job that paid more than minimum wage. It wasn't that I wasn't willing to flip burgers or anything, it just didn't pay enough to keep my lovely lenders off my back. Maybe I'd have felt differently if the ugly garment hadn't cost me $250, even though it was marked down on the clearance rack. I couldn't believe other women paid $750 for such things. It didn't seem possible to my flat-broke state of mind. I was trying to consider it a sound investment into future earnings, but that didn't mean I didn't resent the expense. Apparently, it was legal to commit highway robbery. They just used price scanners instead of guns in these more civilized times. I had somewhat nefarious plans of returning the suit and had sneakily tucked the tag up under my jacket in the back, where you couldn't see it. I typically tried not to be superstitious, but I definitely had my fingers crossed that the tag would stay put and I wouldn't spill anything on my lovely and hopefully temporary purchase. If I didn't land a job, I would be totally and utterly screwed because I was out of money. I didn't even have any credit left at that point. My student worker position at the university had ended 2 weeks prior to graduation. It hadn't made any sense to look for a filler job because, once I had my degree in hand, I would be able to seek far more fulfilling employment in the real world of publishing. But I hadn't factored being homeless into any of my plans. I hadn't been ready to waltz my way down the aisle or anything, but I certainly hadn't been planning to break up with Bryce in the near future. I had no money and no job, and my student loan payment was the size of an inflated house mortgage. At least I'd have a few months before I had to start making payments on that beast. All of it was Bryce's fault. Every time I thought about my ex, I wanted to kick something and scream, but I figured that wasn't acceptable public behavior. Taking the subway was far from glamorous, but that's what you did when you lived in a big city and couldn't afford a cab. I tried not to make eye contact with any of the crazies. As tempting as that molded plastic seat looked, I didn't sit down because the last thing I needed was gum on my expensive interview outfit. I was especially careful not to break a heel on the escalator during my ride back up to street level. All of this would have been easier if I'd had a full night of sleep, but instead it had been filled with nothing but fitful tossing and turning. I hadn't suffered from nightmares since I was a young girl, but something had shifted in me since the breakup. Twisted scenes haunted me each time my head hit the pillow. They were crazy dreams, though most of what happened was forgotten by the time I woke up. Except for one detail. There were always bears. I'm not talking about cute Winnie the Pooh cartoons here. I'm talking about rip your face off and tear your throat out while you go for a walk in the woods. Monsters. I'd literally resisted adding honey to my tea the other day because my subconscious feared that it would attract a bear or something. Right. Like there were bears in the city. It was a short walk from the subway exit to the high-rise office building where my first interview was, so I took my time and tried to focus my mind on more positive thoughts. Basically, anything but bears would have sufficed. I took a deep breath and tried to think confident thoughts like, I'm so getting this job, as I rode up the elevator. I didn't do stairs, not in heels. Stairs were for crazy people who enjoyed exercise. You know, masochists. I may have looked thin on the outside, but that didn't mean I was healthy. I was about as lazy as you could get. Maybe I should have been ashamed of this. But I believe in accepting who you truly are. The elevator doors dinged as they opened to the level occupied by the publishing firm. I screwed a hopeful smile onto my face as I approached the lobby. I checked in with the receptionist and waited patiently until they led me back for my interview. 5 minutes in, I knew something was up. The woman kept checking her email, and she refused to make direct eye contact with me the whole time. Instead of the usual, "we'll get back with you" song and dance routine, she cut right to the chase and told me that I wouldn't be a good fit. I was disappointed, but this wasn't the only firm in town, so I checked my pride and thanked her for her time. Did I mention I'd been having a rough week? Well, apparently, it wasn't getting any better. It actually took me 3 more appointments to figure out what was really going on. "Bryce called you, didn't he?" I accused the man who'd just interviewed me and then promptly explained that I wasn't a good fit for their company. He'd already been trying to show me to the door when I had my big eureka moment and put the last piece of the puzzle in place. The telltale look of guilt on the man's face told me everything I needed to know. My slimy toad of an ex had called around and somehow blacklisted me in the entire publishing community. Bryce's family owned the largest firm in town, so I suppose it wasn't that hard for him to pull a few strings in order to abuse his power and lay me low. The whole thing seemed unusually cruel. It wasn't like I'd been unfaithful to him. He was the cheater. What right did he have to pull such a nasty stunt when he'd already screwed me over? Literally. Did he think I'd come crawling back to him like a beaten-down puppy? Did he think I'd forgive him for being a lying, cheating, not to mention short douche? Was he so conceited that he couldn't see how messed up this whole situation was? I was furious, and I felt like my blood was boiling beneath my cheap-to-the-world yet expensive-to-me suit dress. I imagined burning those sheets he'd tainted, and in several of my fantasies, he was still in the bed when I dropped the match. I wasn't completely ready to throw in the towel, so I went through the motions of my last 2 interviews. Big surprise! The results were exactly the same as they'd been with all the other firms. Exactly what had he told them about me? It must have been seriously awful. I checked my reflection in my compact to make sure that horns hadn't suddenly sprouted from my hair because the last woman had looked at me as though I was evil incarnate. I walked back outside and stood on the street corner waiting for inspiration to strike. But I was plumb out of life-altering decision-making capabilities for the day. Quite frankly, I was feeling beyond disenchanted. Too bad I didn't have any other close friends. Between work and school, I'd only had time for Bryce. So as far as relationships went, I was batting 0. No one was going to offer me their couch, let alone a friendly shoulder to cry on. Right when I was trying to figure out a way to land myself another one of those handy-dandy store loyalty credit cards, I noticed a line of well-dressed men and women curving halfway around the block. They were all dressed similarly to me, only their suits looked a heck of a lot nicer. "What's going on?" I asked the last woman in line. She handed me a computer printout so that I could read for myself. It was a surprisingly long ad. I quickly scanned the text. "Seeking personal assistant. Must be willing to relocate. Blah, blah, blah. Middle of nowhere." If I'd had deeper relationships with people, moving might have been a deal breaker, but I was more than ready for a fresh start. In fact, it seemed like a unique opportunity. Not only was the minimum salary more than generous, but the position also included free room and board. The thought of being able to free myself from the shackles of debt was definitely tempting. In some ways, it seemed as though the job posting had been tailored specifically to me. No doubt everyone else waiting in line felt that way too. Otherwise, they wouldn't still be standing in their uncomfortable formal wear and heels while they sweated off all their pretty makeup. Needless to say, I was intrigued by that point. And as I wasn't faced with any better alternatives, I stepped into line behind the other applicants to try my luck at a job that seemed a little too good to be true. I couldn't help but compare the whole situation to the lottery. only one person would walk away with the jackpot, but we were all excited to buy our tickets, or at least wait our turn for an interview. Surprisingly enough, no one else sidled in after me, so I retained my dead last position. Could that possibly give me an advantage? I would be the last face they saw after a long day. I refused to dwell on the fact that it was far more likely they would be totally zoned out by the time I got my shot. That was loser talk, and I already had enough negative crap going on in my head without feeding it more. Let's hear it for blind optimism, the true friend of desperation. Eventually, I made it inside the building, and the air conditioning wafted over me in a big, welcoming gush. I sighed as the cold air worked to cool my overheated skin. The odds of being able to return the ugly suit were diminishing more by the second. I was getting that hot skin smell that happens when you spend too much time outside. It's different than a BO smell, but still not altogether pleasant. I wasn't ready to completely abandon the notion of getting back my money yet, at least not until I'd landed a job. I began to chant inside my head, "This job is mine," hoping that perhaps the universe would hear and take pity on me. Normally, I tried to avoid such silly activities and focus on concrete actions I could actually control. But my ex and the universe had shown me that I was no longer the governor of my circumstances. By that point, I was sufficiently willing to plead with God if that was what it took to improve my financial prospects. Being inside was so much nicer than baking outside in the heat. The AC helped to revitalize my tired body, and I began to stand straighter again, where before I'd been wilting and drooping. My eyes scanned the walls, which were covered extensively with framed oil paintings. It was like moving through a museum at a snail's pace, so it took me a while before I comprehended that all of the paintings had similar subject matter. Bears! What the what? Why did I feel like I'd just walked inside one of my creepy dreams? If it hadn't been for my unrelenting loop of nightmares, I wouldn't have given the painting's themes a second thought. But my nightmares had been terrifying. Was it possible that this wasn't a coincidence? That the two were somehow connected? If I'd been a superstitious person, I would have turned on my heel and proceeded to run at warp speed until the building was no longer visible. But I considered myself a logical person, and I was desperate for employment. I stopped staring at the walls and focused on the progress of the line itself. There were still a crap ton of people ahead of me, but at least we were moving at a reasonably steady pace. I hadn't been inside for more than 30 minutes when the secretary received a phone call. Mine were not the only eyes trained on the woman with avid interest. 2 seconds after the headset met the cradle of the receiver, she stood and addressed the line of waiting candidates.
I regret to inform you that Mr. Steele won't be conducting any more interviews today. Please leave a copy of your resume with me if you'd still like to be considered for the position. We'd appreciate it if you could show yourselves out of the building.
I stared at the woman in fish-mouthed disbelief. More than a few of the other job seekers were muttering under their breath as they stormed out of the office. Most hadn't bothered to leave a copy of their resumes behind, which showed a general lack of confidence that it would make any difference. It was obvious that the position had already been filled, which meant that I should have obediently turned around and followed the rest of the disappointed candidates in their dejected, feet-dragging stroll towards the exit. Yup. That would have been the logical thing to do, but Sane Crystal had vacated the premises about 5 interviews ago. Not getting a chance to interview after all that waiting in the heat, well, that was the straw that broke the tired and thirsty camel's back. The thought of accepting one more bit of rejection in my day failed to compute. I wasn't ready to seize a weapon and do bodily harm to my fellow humans or anything, but I was totally up for a screaming match if necessary. Everyone has a limit, a point where they just can't take anymore, and they crack. Apparently, I'd reached my breaking point. Like I said, I'd had a rough weekend, My slimy boyfriend had cheated on me, and I'd been cruelly blacklisted from the publishing community I had worked tirelessly to become a part of for years. At that point, I would have to leave town in order to find work in my chosen field of expertise. Adding insult to injury, given how hot it had been outside, I probably had pit stains, which meant there was no way I could return my pricey discount rack suit. I wasn't even going to have a job to show for it. Perhaps my stomach was to blame. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't eaten anything since my hurried, free continental breakfast from the cheap motel where I was staying. All of the PMS hormones raging through my body could also have triggered my crazy outburst. I really don't know for sure what to blame. The tight hold I normally kept on my wayward tongue wrenched free as I strode determinedly over to the secretary's desk. My heels tapped sharp staccato notes on the marble floor, loudly marking each step of my fool's journey. I tried not to let the rage enter my voice as I spoke, and I carefully schooled my features into a look of respectful insistence. I'm not leaving until I see Mr. Steele. Okay, so there was a little more anger in my voice than I'd hoped for. Naughty tongue, bad inflection.
I'm afraid that's not possible. Mr. Steele won't be conducting any more interviews today. You are more than welcome to leave me a copy of your resume, and I'll see that he gets it.
She repeated her statement from before like a mindless robot. She was the type of woman who would never alter the script she'd been given. She'd continue to parrot the same information over and over again, right up until the point she called for security. Obviously, I wasn't going to get anywhere with her, so it was time to try a different tactic. No more arguing. I stared the woman down, sizing her up. She was petite, barely pushing 5 feet, even with the help of her 5-inch heels. She didn't appear to be overly muscular, which was good because I wasn't into weights either. My legs were miles longer, which was a definite boon. Secure in the knowledge that I could best her in a race, I turned and made a mad dash towards Mr. Steele's office. I'd seen countless applicants traipsing in and out of his door all day long. Everyone else had been given a chance to interview with the hotshot billionaire, and that's all I wanted, a chance. It wasn't that I didn't recognize that I was acting totally crazy, but I chose to press forward anyway. In the back of my mind, I was aware that the man would pretty much have to be a lunatic to hire me after I'd exhibited such rash and unprofessional behavior, which was why most of those other people had simply walked away. But I wasn't most people. I was Crystal freaking Banks, and I was done taking no for an answer. Sure, I probably wouldn't be getting the job. All I knew was that I was getting my interview, and that it would be an interview not sabotaged by my ex. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I ran. My arms pumped wildly, and an uncontrollable grin contorted my face as I sped across the lobby. The woman shouted furiously after me to stop, but I ignored her. Security would probably arrive any second to throw me out. On the plus side, if I got arrested, I'd at least be entitled to a hot meal for a night or two. Always look on the bright side of life. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. I hummed the Monty Python song under my breath.